What did I do while I was on vacation? Aside from relaxing at home, I spent some time looking for a Linux distro that might replace Windows in my life. Like many of you, I'm a habitual, ingrained Windows user, and Windows quirks and Microslop spyware and malice aside, I'm perfectly happy with Windows 10. But with Microslop making a serious effort to try and force people to eat, sleep, breathe their AI slop in every product, downgrade to Windows 11, aka Big Brother OS, and close off every avenue to maintain their digital independence, it seems like every Linux tech influencer and Linux bro on YouTube has been pumping out similar choreographed videos urging their viewers to switch to Linux right now and prompting Penguin OS and its ecosystem as the only viable, realistic alternative to Microslop. But is it? Is it really? I plan to find out. And this is what I did. Brace yourselves. This is going to be quite a ride.
They said upgrade or die.
Yep,
Windows
like
10 still flies.
Let's try grab 2 mode.
Now Redman's got that AI gleam in their eyes.
There's Dolphin. Does it show my network? Yeah, it does. Does it access it? Yeah, it accesses it. Impressive. Look at that. Installation failed. This is the kind of shit that happens when you try to install fonts in Linux. You can't close it, you can't minimize it. It's got thousands of these fucking things open up. I think it's probably gonna crash. It's gonna crash the OS just now. Come on, Linux bros, you can do better than this. Seriously. Error. What is this? Repository key. What is a repository key? And why the fuck should I bother with it when I should just be able to download the fucking app and install it? You know what? I am fucking damn. I don't care a damn. You may be wondering what this is all about, so let me give you a quick explanation and bring you up to speed. Late last year, Microslop announced that support for Windows 10 will be discontinued as of October 2025. While this doesn't mean that Windows 10 will stop working, it does mean that Microslop will stop putting out the updates that are supposedly important for your security and virus protection via Windows Defender, but actually just did more damage than anything else, and mainly to Microslop's public image. Driver issues and malfunctions that even stopped Windows 10 PCs from booting, and not to mention the inconvenience of not being able to use your own PC when you need or want to, because it's busy installing Microslop updates for a couple of hours that you didn't ask for. And Microslop won't let you cancel or opt out of. To make all of that even worse, Microslop also made a series of creeping improvements to Windows 11 to force users to log into Microslop accounts to set up and use their Windows 11 PCs, eliminating all the gaps and workarounds that allowed users to create the same traditional offline local accounts they always used previously. On top of that, that old PC that runs Windows 10 perfectly fine and would still run Windows 11 perfectly fine as well is now e-waste because Microslop has forced additional security hardware onto the hardware market to increase their control over their users' lives. Several million computers around the world will not be able to run Windows 11, that is without the use of tricks many techs know about, and as far as Microslop is concerned will simply have to be replaced. The reality is that Microsoft doesn't care about our pockets as users. They don't care what we want as users. They just want to force us to stop using Windows 10 and downgrade to Windows 11 and to just buy new computers to do it. We're not the customers anymore, we're the product. Since Windows 7, Microsoft went monetization mad, forcing users to be advertised at in their browsers and start menus, and systematically reducing our control over our own hardware and software, while profiting off the sale of our data in the form of what we do and when or where we do it. Most users don't want Microsoft's AI garbage installed on our PCs. They've decided that what we want doesn't matter. We will get Windows 11 with Copilot and Windows Recall to record our every action we take on our own PCs. Windows will spy on us and report back to Microsoft, and we'll like it. But the truth is that Microsoft is in trouble. They overstep their boundaries. The majority of their users are not just dissatisfied, but actually angry, and many are refusing to move to Windows 11, preferring to stay with Windows 10, or even go back to Windows 10 from 11. Many are also leaving Windows behind altogether for other platforms like Apple, Linux, Android. Microsoft seems to think that because it's the dominant operating system on the global market, it's untouchable, and that users are captivated to them and have nowhere else to go. The truth is, there's really no such thing as too big to fail or unsinkable. If you have any doubts about that, I can refer you to a mountain of rusty scrap iron at the bottom of the Atlantic called Titanic. Humans are creatures of habit. We like our space, we like our comforts, and above all, we prefer familiarity. Many of us recoil from change, even if it means putting up with a little more discomfort. A lot of people have been considering a move to Linux, some have been jumping ship, and as I mentioned earlier, Linux bros are out there waving their little penguin flags and claiming that switching to Linux from Windows is easy, simple, and convenient. In the past few months, I've watched tons of videos by Linux bros singing its praises and saying enticing things like, "You almost never have to even use the terminal now if you don't want to," and comparing various versions and flavors of the open source OS with regards to how easily Windows users could switch over to it in order to wean themselves of their nasty, masochistic, self-harming Windows habit. And even if you want to use Windows apps, you still can. Just look at how easy it is. All you need to do is install, fill the brand name in here, and you can even run Windows apps, including Microsoft Office, on Linux. What's that? You can run Windows apps on Linux? Really? I decided to put all of that to the test for myself.
Walk like a penguin, touch the mascot's grin, waddle like a penguin, penguin begin.
What do I need from Linux? Well, the same things I need from Windows. And I'm sure that's the same with any user, any computer user. Of all the questions anyone needing to change operating systems, and in this case Windows users, need to ask themselves, I would think that one is the most critical. If you're thinking of making a switch to Linux from Windows, I think you should be asking yourself this question and considering the options very, very seriously. Now, Linux these days tends to look very similar to Windows, and I'd say that's been done on purpose, since Linux developers, especially the bigger ones, have made it their goal to rival or even ultimately replace Windows. Looking familiar to Windows or various Windows versions like 7, 10, or 11 is one way they're trying to appeal to those Windows users considering making that switch. That said, aside from the skin-deep similarities in appearance, Linux and Windows are two completely different animals under the skin. Getting to grips with Linux as a basic pinky toe in the water Windows user can be a daunting and even off-putting ordeal. But if you can figure out how to install it on your PC, or a spare PC, and watch a fuck ton of YouTube how-to Linux videos, you might eventually get to grips with it without tripping over the GNOME or getting mauled by the GNU. If at that level though, you just use the apps that generally come bundled with most Linux distros, you should be just fine. But if you need to install specific software, that's where the fun starts. As easy as the Linux bros say using and operating Linux is, that's quite often far from the truth. Becoming a Linux user means you're going to have to become far more involved in Linux than you were in Windows. And that means getting to grips with the terminal, learning new command structures, and probably several of those, since different branches of Linux use different kernels based on C or POSIX to varying degrees with different commands. May the odds ever be in your favor. Another important thing you need to consider is internet and network access, both of which I find vital. Linux, being different to Windows, can be a closed book when it comes to figuring out why you can't find or access network shares. Say on your NAS, for example, in Linux's file manager, but can in Windows. What about me? What are my favorite, most used or essential critical apps on Windows? I use a lot of apps on Windows, as I'm sure most of you do too. In my case, there are quite a few, like VideoPad, that I could happily replace with substitutes that work on Linux. But there are one or two that simply have no actual Linux substitutes at all. There are a load of Linux apps that come close, but as the old saying goes, no cigar. For me, the two absolutely indispensable, irreplaceable apps are iPhoto Plus 4, a really ancient scrap of software that easily runs off a USB drive, but does all the basic graphics editing I need for my purposes, and either MS Office 2013 or 2016. I use MS Office for just about everything, designing logos, graphics, book covers, icons, and graphics for videos in PowerPoint, typing and formatting my books and academic papers in Word, and managing my budget and other spreadsheets in Excel. And of course, all of these also for work. Like most employer environments, the baseline is Windows and MS Office for everything. There are Linux versions of other apps I use, like Vivaldi Browser, OBS Studio, and VLC Media Player, just to name a few. And like the vast majority of Linux apps, these are free. So that's perfectly fine by me. Switching to them won't even be an issue. The challenge though, aside from finding a style, version or distro of Linux I'd be happy to use every day, will be finding a way to make those two vital Windows apps work on it. To that end, I decided to test 11 Linux distros to see which of the 4 most talked about Windows emulators would install and run my two vital Windows apps, Wine, Bottles, Winboat, and Playonlinux.
Walk like a penguin, touch the mascot's grin, waddle like a penguin, penguin begin.
I started my Linux experiment by downloading a selection of Linux distros off the web. I chose the ones that seemed to be the most talked about and popular, including a few by smaller developers and a few by larger, more corporate developers, just to give a more rounded picture. The Linux Bros claims that you won't have to use the terminal much in modern Linux is just so much hot air. Of course you have to use the terminal, it's inevitable with Linux, and it's fucking annoying. I'll talk more in detail about my annoyances with the terminal in Linux later. The 4 emulator apps I decided to use for this test are Wine and Bottles. See what they did there? It's adorable, isn't it? Playonlinux and Winboat. Since I've not seen anyone actually claiming that Wine or Bottles will install or run MS Office by themselves, I decided to focus on using them to test basic Windows apps instead, and emulators like Playonlinux and Winboat, which actually do make that claim, to try to install MS Office. Since all of them appear to rely on Wine as well, this could be interesting. Before I get into the test, I want to emphasize that this is in no way a formal lab test or curated, peer-reviewed evaluation of any of these Linux distros or emulators. It's simply my own effort intended to make sense of my own experiences in installing them, trying or failing to get them to work, and conclusions on my own. You should make your own minds up. Lastly, for the sake of clarity, transparency, and comparison, I need to mention that the computers used as test beds also install and run Windows 10 perfectly. Also, the distros of Linux are arranged alphabetically. Let's see how it went. I started with Anduin.
All the old distros say, switch to Linux today.
I tested 2 different versions of Anduin, each with adorable names like Noble Numbat and Questing Quokka. Both behaved in exactly the same way, in that both these versions of Anduin ran fine as a pre-install live boot from USB on my test systems, but it was a struggle to install any of them to a PC. Towards the end of the installation process, on the first 2 or 3 attempts, it suffered fatal errors. It did this even with changing BIOS settings and Ventway boot settings, and then a few days later the same ISO of Noble Numbat just installed without any issues. As a result, I conducted my evaluation of that version of Anduin. Not only is Anduin simple and pretty to look at, but it also auto-mounts USB drives inserted into the PC, rather than just telling you there's a new drive and giving you the option to mount it. It detected my network right away and showed me all the shares on my network except for one, my laptop share, which none of these distros seemed to want to show. Instead, it showed the other shares on the other devices that were online at the time, which was good enough, but it still wouldn't let me access them. Even web searches for solutions and then attempting to apply them, even using the terminal, made no difference. Even installing Dolphin File Manager didn't help. Wine wouldn't install, but Bottles did using the terminal. And I installed basic Windows apps like Notepad++ and Winamp 5 just to test them, and they were able to open via the Bottle window library. iPhoto Plus 4 wouldn't install, but ran from its live folder on the USB. Bottles would not install either MS Office 2013 or 2016, 32 or 64-bit. Winboat installed, but without all its dependencies, which I was unable to install or get to work, even searching for them online and using the terminal. Playonlinux did install, but wouldn't run. Clicking on the icon in the start menu had no effect. To sum up, Anduin installed and ran just fine, eventually. Accessed the internet, but not my network, and installed or ran 3 basic Windows apps in Bottles, but did not install MS Office. Then I moved on to Arch,
Walk like a penguin.
which wouldn't run as a live ISO, nor would it install, so I couldn't perform any of my tests on it.
Terminal's your friend. Type sudo apt install.
Big Linux ran and installed just fine. Does not auto-mount USB drives inserted into the PC, but does access and show my network shares with Dolphin, which comes as a default file manager. Its layout is similar to Windows 7 or 10 and even 11, depending on which layout you choose during the installation, and offers several choices of desktop or taskbar and menu layout. The wallpapers are very striking, different and adorable, with what looks like several hundred in the Change Wallpaper dialog window. Yes, they're obviously AI generated, but they're cute, funny, and make beautiful backgrounds. To summarize, I installed Big Linux on 2 different systems and tested it on 3 by switching the SSD between them. On one occasion, the system crashed and I had to reinstall it to that SSD. I installed Wine, which installed Notepad++ and Winamp without any problems, and I was able to create working shortcuts to open them on the desktop. And although iPhoto Plus 4 wouldn't install in Wine, I was able to copy the live folder to downloads and create a shortcut on the desktop that pointed to the exe file, and that worked fine as well. Wine would not install any version of MS Office that I tried. For Office 2013, it would default to asking me for a product key for the same version that didn't ask for one in Windows. For Office 2016, it would run the install until about 20% before crashing out with an error message. Bottles also installed basic Windows apps, but failed to install any version of MS Office that I tried. On one machine, while testing Winboat, it wouldn't continue setup because the motherboard did not include virtualization technology, and on another, it detected 4 GB of DDR3 RAM as too little and wouldn't continue. The first time I installed Winboat, it installed all its dependencies, and the only thing holding it back was the lack of virtualization capability. But that was on the installation that crashed, so I had to start over. The second time, Winboat, installed from the very same location, did not install all its dependencies, such as Docker, Docker Compose version 2, and FreeRDP 3.xx. And after struggling for over 2 hours with that, I installed the alternative dependency to Docker, being Podman, after which Winboat then informed me that Docker and Docker Compose version 2 were now installed. And there was no sign of Podman. I also want to mention that the PC which Winboat claimed had no virtualization technology is the same PC I used to set up a WAMP server in 2024 using virtualization technology this thing said it didn't have. But even though I'd finally got to the point where I finally had Winboat and all its dependencies installed and working, I still couldn't get Winboat to work. You see, the entire point of Winboat is that it installs a version of Windows into a virtual machine in order to smoothly run whichever Windows apps you want to use on your Linux PC. Microsoft Office is specifically mentioned on the list of tested apps that supposedly work on Winboat. Near as I can work it out, the other emulators work on a similar, simpler principle, but without installing Windows. Anyway, at the point where you're supposed to select which version of Windows you want to install to Winboat, or select a Windows ISO if you have one, it either jumps to an error and failure message, or does so early in the installation. I tried not selecting an ISO at all. I tried changing ISOs. I tried moving the ISOs from my flash disk to the downloads folder on the SSD. But
It won't make any difference.
I clicked on the help link and followed all the advice on there. I even visited Linux and Winboat forums for a clue.
Throw me a frickin' bone here.
All to no avail. This would be a recurring issue with Winboat in all the other distros that I tested afterwards. Playonlinux installed, I was then able to install basic Windows apps like Notepad++ and Winamp, but not any version of MS Office. I should point out that when an app vendor describes their app as being tested and verified as running certain software and it fails to deliver on that promise not just once but repeatedly, it's really annoying. I then moved on to Catchy OS.
Walk like a penguin.
Catchy ran as a live ISO, but wouldn't complete an installation without crashing. Look at that. Installation failed. Well, let's see what happens if we reboot. Maybe it will have been successful somehow, in spite of everything else. No, it's not looking very encouraging. So I couldn't perform any of my tests on it. Then moved on to Fedora.
Walk like a penguin.
Fedora is one of the larger, more established corporate entities in the Linux ecosystem, so surely they should have their act together. As polished looking as Fedora 43 is, it also turned out to be the slowest distro in these tests. Considering that these computers that I'm using are about 15 years old, that really says something. Fedora took a long time to boot from the live ISO and then also to install to the SSD. It also took its sweet time in installing any of the software that I installed to perform these tests, to the extent that I wondered if it was actually installing or had crashed. Fedora did not auto-mount USB drives, but it does come with Dolphin Linux and sees my network shares and lets me access them. Wine installed directly from the software manager and I was able to install Notepad++. It worked and created a working shortcut on the desktop. Winamp 5.0 did the same thing, but for some reason failed to detect the sound card or driver and wouldn't play any sound. Boy, where's my... device not found? What are you talking about? We know the sound is working. It's been playing system sounds. iPhoto Plus would also not install but ran the live version from the USB. It also would not install any version of MS Office I tried to install. Bottles also installed from the software manager, but in the run of trying to install Winamp to see if it might work properly through Bottles, it simply crashed and would not complete the installation. Okay, it's now nearly 3 o'clock. It's been almost an hour since I've tried to install it and it's not working, so I'm going to call it crashed. Winboat was not included in the software manager or store or whatever it's called in Fedora, so I had to look for it on the Winboat website. I downloaded and installed the latest version. When I opened Winboat to set it up afterwards, none of the dependencies had been installed. I installed Podman, but that didn't have any effect at all. Then I looked for Docker, same story. I had to go to the Docker website, followed all the instructions, and still couldn't get it to work properly. During the installation, it crashed. Next, I looked for Playonlinux, which was in the built-in software manager store, and installed it. Clicking on the icon in the menu had the same result as in Linux. Later on, the screen flashed and nothing else happened. The second time I installed it, it wouldn't even finish installing. I then moved on to Mint.
Walk like a penguin.
Oh dear, it won't install Wine. How about that? What about Bottles? Anyway, now I'm going to attempt to install Office. And as usual, it's going to fail. See, now it gives a completely different error. Module not found. Is Winboat worth it? At this point, no. Which Fedora this is Mint, so which one is it supposed to be? I don't know. Let's try this one. Oh, for God's sake. It's cute that they say, yeah, it's Windows for penguins. It's all very cute, but it's just that none of it works. So now it's going to give me a list of things that isn't there, instead of installing it all at once. See, it wants all of this shit. See, now I've got to go look for Docker. Now we can install Docker for the 100 millionth time. Dependency is not satisfiable. I just can't get no satisfaction. Yeah, well, that's it then. Docker won't install. Now let's try installing Playonlinux. Okay. No, it doesn't like that either. How about that? After installation, Mint did not show the contents of my network folder. It comes with a different file manager just called Files, and nothing I tried, even using the terminal, would change that. After some considerable time and effort, I installed Dolphin File Manager instead, and that did show me some of the shared folders in my network, but still would not allow me to access any of them. On the plus side, Mint does auto-mount USB drives when inserted without asking the user to click Mount and Open. Wine did not complete installation. Bottles installed, but although it installed Notepad++ and Winamp, it wouldn't install any version of MS Office. Winboat installed, but after that I wasted another hour struggling to get Docker and its own dependencies installed, which was not successful, and then Podman, which seemingly did nothing at all. Playonlinux, which when I tried to install anything with, instantly gave me fatal errors and wouldn't continue. I have to point out at this time that Mint is the distro that gets recommended the most frequently as the most user-friendly and easy version of Linux for Windows users to switch to. Apparently not when I needed it to install apps designed for Windows on apps designed for Linux. I then moved on to Nobara.
Oh, Linux Pro scream switch now, but wine won't run my sheet.
Well, fuck me. It actually installed this time. Yeah, this is Dolphin. Okay, let's see. Does it pick up my network? Shared folders. Nope. That's interesting. What? Would not connect to my internet. What's that? This is not working. Nobara Linux was more problematic and difficult than any of the other versions I tested. The first installation attempt took so long, in fact, that I walked out of the room when it was at 12% to get a refill of coffee, and when I got back about 15 or 20 minutes later, the PC was off and the installation had not completed. Turning it on presented me with a fail to start some other demon blah blah message. I tried a second time, but Nobara wouldn't complete an install without crashing. I tried a second and third time. A few days later, I tried another time. This time, much to my surprise, it actually installed. Nobara does not auto-mount USB drives. It came with Dolphin File Manager installed, but as Nobara refused to connect to my Wi-Fi internet, that was as far as I could go, and I couldn't perform any further tests on it.
Walk like a penguin.
Red Hat Enterprise, otherwise known as RHEL. Another staunchly original corporate form of Linux, Red Hat has been around since the 2000s. The trouble with trying their free version of Linux that I found is that even though it's free, they expect you to register and create an account on their website before they let you download it. Doesn't that remind you of Microslop? That just hits me hard in the old pathological demand avoidance That said, their website is not the only place you can find it without having to cross anyone's T's or dot their I's. Be that as it may, even though I tried 4 times on one day and twice on another day, varying between boot normal, boot with grub 2, or memboot, the ISO live version wouldn't open. It kept crashing and rebooting into a boot loop. I then moved on to Ubuntu.
Oh, it's too late, it's all over.
Okay, how do I connect to the internet on this thing? The net. Bloop. Okay, now what? I've clicked on it. What now? Fuck's sakes. A heck of a faff to get ordinary fucking things done on this shitty bloody fucking... Now let's try this again. Network. It picks it up right away. Does it access it? No, it doesn't. Come on, Jesus Christ. Alt tab work? Nope, no effect. Phasers have no effect, Captain. And nothing. App Center won't open. Let's just try install. No results. Okay. Let's try apps. I wouldn't use this thing if you paid me to. You know what? I'm going to reboot. If I can figure out how. It's fucking bizarre. It doesn't have a conventional taskbar. The app's icons on this, whatever this shit thing is, don't behave like proper Windows ones do. It doesn't behave even like other distros of Linux. Even this is the most un-Linux-like version of Linux I've tried. It's useless. So I guess that's the end of Ubuntu. Ubuntu installed easily, but that was the only thing about it I found easy. First off, it doesn't look anything like any of the other distros I tested in the run of this experiment. Menus are all over the place. The taskbar has almost none of the same functions as the taskbars in other Linux distros. Plus it's stuck to the left side of the screen and so far as I could tell can't be relocated. The clock has its own panel across the top of the screen with the power button on the far right. It took me 10 minutes to figure out how to find the network settings just to connect it to my network and show me one network share. And even after that, it still wouldn't let me access it. The most frustrating part was that I couldn't get the App Center to open so that I could install any of the apps I needed to conduct my tests, starting with Dolphin. Whenever I clicked on the App Center icon, it would just blink and nothing would happen, even after a reboot. I spent half an hour trying to figure this thing out, but in vain. I would have to say that if you're leaving Windows and looking for an easy version of Linux to switch to and aren't already a Linux geek or a dyed-in-the-wool Linux evangelist or a masochist, Ubuntu is not the one for you. The only nice thing I have to say about Ubuntu Linux is that it auto-mounted my USB flash drive. And then from Linux to Winux.
All the old distros say, switch to Linux today.
Oh, whole 8%. This is gonna take a while. Would you stop doing that? So I guess no, that's not gonna work. So, right, where's the app center on this thing? So it doesn't have an app store. Alright then. Now is there a terminal thing here? Console. Error. What is this? Repository key. What is a repository key? And why the fuck should I bother with it when I should just be able to download the fucking app and install it? This is shit. You know what? I am fucking damn. I don't care a damn. Formerly called Ubuntu and Linux FX before that, Linux 11 is another Brazilian distro like Big Linux. I've noticed a lot of Linux bros, let's call them purists, hating on it, calling it dangerous, and warning their audiences not to use it. Oddly enough, the only negative things they criticized about it in a Linux context was that A, it looked a lot like Windows, B, when it was still Linux FX, the original youthful dev made some cheeky replies once to criticism about making a noob mistake and getting his server hacked, and C, questions around legality and wondering why Winux hasn't been sued yet for including Microsoft logos and apps like Edge, Copilot, OneDrive, etc. Curiously enough, the criticisms of this distro as dangerous seem to be directed at the developer rather than at the distro itself. I asked myself why that is. Is it because Winux does such a brilliant job of closely imitating the desktop environments of both Windows 10 and 11? Is it because it provides such a clear, simple and easy way for Windows apostates to feel less lost, panicked and insecure in migrating to Linux? It strikes me that's the real reason they hate it so much. So maybe they are just sadomasochists after all, not being happy unless they can trick Windows users into migrating to Linux so they can spend their days typing commands into that terminal like it's 1980. That said, this distro is another one that came with Dolphin File Manager that could access shares on my home network. Although it has an annoying habit of asking me for my Winux password every single time I open a shared folder, and then sometimes it just stops giving me access altogether and tells me the resource no longer exists. Aside from that huge annoyance, there are a few pluses, such as that it actually comes with Winboat and all its dependencies pre-installed. No mess, no fuss. And all you have to do to use it is to open it, point it to a Windows ISO and install that. As usual, that was easier said than done. But first, let's see how it handled other emulators. Winux 11, as far as I could tell, doesn't have any sort of included app store. Its app manager only shows apps that are currently installed, and also not all of them. Refer to my earlier remarks that Edge is not listed at all. For that reason, I was left trying to figure out what Winux is based on, Debian or whatever. As it turns out, it's based on Ubuntu, which probably explains why it's such a pain in the ass. That said, I found it extremely difficult to install any software on Winux 11. Downloaded files didn't open. No software installer appeared to react or appear, and neither wine nor bottles could be installed, even with commands being pasted into the terminal. Whether they were the right commands or not, I can't really say, but they were the ones suggested by the sites supplying these apps for distros based on Ubuntu. Although Winboat comes pre-installed with all its dependencies, and as far as I can tell, it's the only distro that offers its users that convenience. You still have to set it up and get it to install Windows so it will run Windows apps. On the first attempt, I selected the Windows 10 ISO direct from Microsoft servers via the setup panel, which crashed at around 20% of the download. But at least I finally got to see what the Winboat interface looks like after it thinks it's finished installing. and then I had to figure out how to remove the failed virtual Windows 10 installation before trying again. The second time I pointed it to an ISO on a flash disk in the USB slot. The dialog said it would take up to an hour, so I sat back to wait. No error messages, no crashes. It just kept on circling that install window for 2 hours before I went to bed and left it to its own devices, hoping that this time would be different. I stopped in to check on it after 3 a.m. on the way to the loo, as one does, to find that nothing had changed, realized it was never going to install, and just turned it off at the plug. The next morning, different strategies like copying the ISO to the downloads folder had no effect. It just did the same thing, that is, nothing, only much faster. I waited a full hour for it to finish installing Windows into Winboat's virtual machine, and it never did. Something weird also happened once during this experiment, and Linux was the only distro I tested that did this. While trying to view system settings, it decided to start confusing languages and display items in the same window in a mix of English and Portuguese. I figured Linux had lost the plot again or was having a stroke, and again pulled the plug. I repeated this exercise again on another day before finally giving up on it, after something like 8 hours in total spent struggling to get the Winboat that came pre-installed with Linux 11 to actually float or work at all. And in spite of numerous efforts, I was unsuccessful. The previous time I managed to install Playonlinux, which I found listed in the Power Tools apps window, and installed it. But that time, clicking on the icon to open Playonlinux in the menu afterwards did absolutely nothing. It simply would not run. The next time, I was unable to even locate an entry for Playonlinux and was unable to install it successfully from the Playonlinux website. There were a few irritating peculiarities about Linux 11. The first being that it includes Copilot AI branding, but thankfully not a version of Copilot itself. It appears to be just decoration. And the Chromium-based Linux version of the Edge browser, which are two of the reasons many users want to get away from Windows 11. The Edge browser is probably the worst browser on the internet since its predecessor, Internet Explorer, and for all the same shitty reasons, including the part where Linux 11 won't let you remove it. The same is true for the Copilot logo on the taskbar. I couldn't find any options to remove either of them, and even if I deleted that annoying Edge shortcut on the desktop, it would be back the next time I restarted the PC, as if just to rub it in. On top of that, even though Linux 11 also ships with regular Google Chrome pre-installed, and even if you set your Chrome browser to be your default browser whenever you need to go online for something or click a web shortcut, Linux defaults to opening it with Edge. The version of OneDrive it ships with is open source, designed to emulate the Microslop product, which I suppose is fine if you buy into all that cloud subscription nonsense, but doesn't come from Microsoft. It seems like the devs really did their very, very best to imitate Windows 11, right down to the finest detail, even the more irritating ones. Job well done on that part, I guess. Objective achieved. It's almost as irritating as being used by actual Windows 11. Other frustrating peculiarities and oddities include trying to adjust the weather widget on the taskbar to show temperatures in Celsius instead of Fahrenheit. It doesn't work. Even if you update the region, the language, and number format settings to any of the other long list of countries and languages that use the metric system. I tried this twice on 2 different installations with the same outcome. By the time I finished with Linux 11, I don't mind telling you, I was thoroughly frustrated by it. Yes, it looks very much like Windows 11, even when using the Windows 10 desktop, which makes it fairly easy for Windows users to find their way around for the main stuff. But the experience is still more like groping in the dark and feeling along the wall for a light switch rather than walking down a well-lit corridor. The lack of functionality and even the natively installed widgets and apps like the weather widget not displaying the right temperature gradient or Winboat not completing its own setup all create the impression of an unfinished product. No need to fret, Linux bros, hating on Linux. As it turns out, Linux is just as broken as every other distro I've tried so far.
Walk like a penguin, touch the mascot's grin, waddle like a penguin, begin.
Zorin 18 Core. The Zorin flagship was the last distro that I tested, at least alphabetically, and things seemed to go better from the outset. After the installation, I connected to my Wi-Fi router and tested the file manager that came with Zorin. It did not detect or display any network shares, so I installed Dolphin File Manager and was given full access to my network shares, except my laptop, which remained invisible because, well, reasons. Zorin also auto-mounted my USB drives, bonus point there. Wine installed smoothly. I installed Notepad++ again, followed by Winamp. Both created shortcuts on the desktop and worked without any functional issues. And for the first time in this entire experiment, I was able to get MP3 files anywhere on my PC and not just in the virtual drive folders to play in Winamp with a right-click open with function. However, I've noticed that some of these distros don't let these apps using Wine work properly, such as Winamp, which needs access to the sound driver to be of any use. In another distro I tested, there was no sound. But in Zorin, as in several others, there was an audio buffer underrun that made listening to music pretty pointless.
Winamp. It really whips the llama's ass.
Impressive. Aside from the buffering issue. Again, even adjusting the audio buffer in Winamp didn't really make much difference, and it seems with all the steady humming and buzzing coming out of the speakers that some distros just didn't like the sound card on this PC. I wasn't going to faff around with trying to find the right drivers and install drivers to try and sort this problem. That wasn't really the goal of this experiment, so I'm not faulting any of these distros on sound card issues. But what it did bring up was the fact that there is a definite delay in things like this because the Windows app has to get translated through Linux through the emulation layer, and this is what actually I think caused the buffer underrun. I could be wrong, but that's how I understand it. So you should also take this into account if you're planning on running software through an emulator on Linux. On the plus side of this installation, I was able to do a full installation of iPhoto Plus 4 for the very first time using the 16-bit installer, which was really a blast from the past. Even so, after the installation, it just disappeared and didn't create any entries in Wine's folder or desktop shortcuts, so it was pretty pointless in the end. Wine also wouldn't install MS Office 2013. It again asked for a product key, even though the same version when installed in Windows 10 did not. For Office 2016, the screen flashed and the install window would not open. I have to point out that issues aside, of all the Wine installation tests I did on these distros, this one in Zorin gave me the best experience. After that, I installed Bottles through an app in the taskbar listing called Windows App Support, which hadn't done anything previously when I clicked on it, and all of a sudden, now it opened a window to install Wine and Bottles simultaneously. Yes, Bottles runs on Wine, and so do all the other emulators as far as I know. Even so, Bottles did the same as most of the other previous distros. It installed and ran basic Windows apps, but would not install either Pro or standard 32 or 64-bit MS Office 2013. This time giving a missing module error. When trying to install Office 2016, the screen flashed again as it did in Wine and nothing happened. Installing Winboat was successful, but installing its dependencies, which again had to be looked for and downloaded or installed separately, resulted in a situation where some were installed but not running or able to start, and some were supposedly installed but not showing. It did not go well. Then I installed Playonlinux and it gave me nothing but trouble. In the earlier tests when I tried to install iPhoto Plus 4, Office 2016 and 2013, in each case it just did the same thing as previously. It just crashed out with error messages. In the final batch of tests, it would give error messages before I even pointed it to the install files for Office. And that was the end of my journey with Zorin, and my experiment, and my patience with Linux.
Terminal's your friend. Type sudo apt install.
So now that that is all done, let's take a look at the results. I've created these neat little PowerPoint slides on Windows to show you how this went. The first one shows the results of the first batch of tests I did on 9 distros in the first half of December. And the second one shows the second batch of tests I did covering 11 distros from late December until early January. You can just pause the video on these slides if you want to, examine them more closely, but my report here is based off them and gives a more complete picture. As you can see, aside from the little differences here and there between them regarding network access and viewing shares, installation issues and so on, there isn't a single one that would mesh properly with emulators like Wine Bottles, Winboat or Playonlinux to get any standalone version of MS Office to work on Linux. Sure, you could just use the online subscription version of Microsoft 365 Copilot, formerly known as Microsoft Office, and get price gouged, or try any one of a dozen imitations on Linux that try to do all the same things as the original but don't quite cover everything. But at least they're free, right? That said, after trying different ways to get Linux to run Windows apps reliably, or in some cases at all, and after having had a veritable tour of all the currently popular distros and then some, and having had a crash course reminder of how irritating and unnecessary it is to be prompted for your password every single time you want to access a network drive or install an app, I think you might understand that I've had enough of this shit for now. I'm tired, frustrated, and fed up. If I see another penguin-themed pun, app name or logo today, I'll probably lay an egg. In retrospect, I have to raise a few questions, such as if Linux bros claim Linux is so easy to use for Windows to switch to, why do they ignore the difficulties that make it much harder to use than it needs to be? Like having to use the terminal to sort out basic problems that in Windows would have a graphical solution. Why also do they misrepresent the fact that sooner or later you're going to have to use the terminal to do something that could have been resolved with a few mouse clicks? Why do they also gloss over the harsh reality that Linux is really several different ecosystems sheltering under the same umbrella, each with its own unique terminal commands, installation formats, quirks and workarounds that need far more than a basic understanding of Linux of a Windows user to find their feet in? How about the apps in Linux that make little to no sense? For example, many of the distros I tested came with file managers that wouldn't allow me to access shared folders on my home network, which I think would be a basic requirement, wouldn't you? Especially when it comes to productivity. Instead, I had to install Dolphin File Manager because I noticed earlier that it mostly picked up my network shares and usually gave me access to them. So that implies you need to install extra software to make Linux usable. And as a newbie Windows refugee, it's also up to you to stumble around in the dark trying to work out A, what the problem is, and B, how to fix it, or what apps you need to install to fix it. And then C, learn the terminal two-step with both feet tied behind your back. I'd also like to point out that none of the file managers that I found came with these Linux distros that are supposedly so easy to use and so familiar looking for Windows users show a Windows Explorer-like interface where it shows you the folder tree on the left-hand side and the folder contents on the right-hand side. Instead, you have to figure it out for yourself. It's so DOS and Windows 3.1 like. Add to that the Linux proclivity for making user-friendly into a sarcastic taunt. During the run of this experiment, there wasn't a single distro that didn't allow me to not create a password to use Linux, or to enter it every single time I wanted to do anything on my computer that I take for granted on Windows, like accessing files, opening network shares, installing apps, or unlocking my screen when I returned from a toilet break. If you thought Microslop was abnormally obsessive about security, you should try Linux. On top of all that, there's very little conformity or sameness between Linux distros. Apps behave one way in some distros and a completely different way in others. For example, installing Wine in some distros creates entries or shortcuts in the taskbar apps menu. In others, the same version of Wine doesn't show up anywhere in the apps listing, alphabetically or otherwise. In a few cases, these apps finish installing but completely disappear. So you can't tell if they're actually installed. And you can only figure out if they're there or not if you try to open an exe file. In others, they show up as icons, and sometimes when you click on them, they open a window, or the only thing they do is flash and never open. It seems to me Linux is what you get when you have several thousand people all working independently to create something, and they all have their own ideas about how it should be done. I get it. I get that Linux is a small niche interest for its fans and enthusiasts. But how do the people promoting it as being the hot new OS that's going to replace Windows to the masses think something this diverse in differences, features, behaviors disjointedness, dysfunctionality, and confusion could be a viable and complete replacement for Windows. It's unrealistic, it's ridiculous, it's annoying, and the glibness with which Linux bros paint these rosy pictures of how much better Linux is than Windows, and how easy it is to switch permanently and leave Windows behind, is disingenuous, disconnected from reality, and frankly insulting. Sure, it's easy to switch, isn't it? All you need to do is format your hard disk and install Linux. And that's when the Linux bros vanish, leaving you alone to figure it all out by yourself. Most of us realize that Microslop is a dystopian horror story, obsessed with forcing AI slop onto us, controlling our lives and selling our data, and Windows 11 is a corporate predatory capitalist shitshow that everyone should get away from. But I honestly don't see Linux as it is today as being that clear, obvious, workable alternative solution for the vast majority of Windows users.
Walk like a penguin, touch the mascot's grin, waddle like a penguin, begin.
So how do I end off this video? Well, if I were to sum up my experience with switching to Linux over the past few weeks in a single word, I would use words like disappointment, frustration, irritation. If I were to summarize it in a sentence, it would be something like, this shit doesn't work as advertised. You can disagree if you like, but that's how I experienced it. Or maybe I should admit that as a lifelong Windows user and total Linux novice, I clearly have no idea what I'm doing, and that these failures are probably all because of something I did or didn't do. Or maybe I could blame the hardware. Yeah, maybe I could do that. A couple of dual-core PCs more than 10 years old and a 9-year-old laptop that somehow managed to install and run Windows 10 perfectly without any issues. Must be them, right? Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not claiming to be an expert in Linux by any stretch. And I'm sure I probably made a lot of mistakes or missed a lot of clues in the process that many experienced Linux users who are watching this right now are likely clicking their tongues or laughing about. But here's the point. Let's just imagine for a moment that we live in a world where all these emulation apps actually do work as advertised. And if someone with years of experience in troubleshooting Windows PCs and installing software struggled as much as I did and failed to get them to work as advertised on multiple distros of Linux, how the fuck do Linux bros expect a plain, average, ordinary Windows user to do it? Or to abandon Windows and to operate Linux successfully as a daily driver? It doesn't make any sense. Now, this results in an increased likelihood of instant regret, feeling intimidated, let's call it buyer's remorse. And for any kind of product hoping to make headway in a highly competitive market, that's never a good thing. Yes, I'm aware that Linux has made massive progress in recent years and is making inroads into the gaming industry, where a working alternatives to Windows is sorely needed. And I'm really happy about that. If all you need to do on your PC is run games, that's fine. I've seen loads of reviews showing how well it's doing in that area. But when it comes to productivity and creativity and meeting everybody's needs, it's not as simple as that. I'm sure the Linux distros I reviewed in my experiment all have their fans and probably install and work just fine on their systems. But this is how it turned out for me. I did the best I could, and I admit that as I progressed through the 11 different distros that I tested, I became more and more irritated, frustrated, and even angry. So I'm sure I could have made a few mistakes along the way. I suppose I could also have struggled a little longer, a little harder. Maybe I could have run the same tests on the same distros 3 or 4 times, or 5 or 6, instead of just once or twice. But I honestly didn't see the point. I want to point out yet again that the PCs I ran these tests on all install and run Windows 10 perfectly, so I have no serious doubts that the outcome of these tests is due to hardware issues. After all, so many Linux bros have made videos that show how easy it is to install these emulators and run Windows apps on Linux, so it must be true. That must mean that it's my fault because I probably didn't follow all their instructions, guides, and how-to videos step by step properly and get them to work, right? I mean, how hard could it be to get Linux to display and access plain old network shares? It's probably not Linux's fault at all. I'm just stupid. So if anything, all of that only serves to underline my finding that Linux isn't as simple, easy, or as easy to use or to switch over to from Windows for everybody, which is really sad because there are millions of dissatisfied Windows users up for grabs right now, ready to move to the right alternative OS if it comes along. And if they try Linux, the odds are a lot of them would just keep on looking, or just stay where they are. Which makes me wonder if anyone is tracking the number of people who left Windows for Linux returning to Windows. There are plenty of stats being thrown around by Linux bros claiming so many 100,000 or million downloads of whatever distro have taken place over the last few months, and celebrating that they're catching up to Microslop. But how many of them can show stats for how many people have installed Linux in the past few months and stuck with it, or gave up and moved to something else? If the Linux bros really want to make a proper dent in the market and compete with or hope to replace Windows, the fact is they're going to have to make Linux and its apps a lot more like the things it's going to replace. None of that faffing about with terminals, 3 million different incompatible formats of install files, and users needing to have programming skills to do anything beyond simply opening and closing the apps that come with their flavor of Linux. This is the 21st century. We want less typey, more pointy, clicky. And so until the time that happens, no. Sorry, Linux bros, I'm still sticking with Windows 10, but on my own terms. If I find anything else that might be worth it for me to switch to, I'll let you know. In the meantime, there are easy ways to de-bloat, decrapify, and de-spyware a Windows installation, like the Christina tool, or you could try Atlas OS. Tools that cut the crap and bloat and spyware out of a standard Windows OS. A local account only, no Edge, no OneDrive, no Cortana or Copilot, and all Microsoft's hot garbage updates blocked permanently. My PC is mine, and so is everything on it. It just works, no drama. That's it, that's the video. Thanks so much for watching. It's already mid-January, my vacation is over, I'm starting work on Monday, and I've also got 2.5 months to finish chapter 1 of my thesis for my PhD, so I'll try to stick to my video posting schedule as much as I can. That said, I hope you all have the best year ahead, and you can catch me in the next one. My name is Christina Engela. Thank you for watching.